What if the reason nothing works in American politics isn't corruption, isn't stupidity? It's that we're literally speaking different languages and don't even know it. Dr. Arnold Kling has spent years inside political institutions like the Fed and Freddie Mac before walking away and writing about one of the most dangerous ideas in political theory, that progressives, conservatives, and even libertarians aren't having the same argument. They're not even speaking the same language. And if that wasn't enough, Dr. Kling now says by the end of this year, it'll be reckless to trust a doctor or a lawyer who refuses to use AI. This is the Big Questions with Big John. I'm Big John, and let's get into it with Dr. Kling. Dr. Kling, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Is a libertarian economist, writer. He's an independent scholar. He's been focused on a lot of different things in his long and storied career: political polarization, institutional design, macroeconomics, healthcare, financing, the social effects of AI. So we're going to try to uh, learn a little bit about him, and he can explain some of his concepts to us. Uh, and hopefully, we'll learn something from this very accomplished man. Arnold, you started out, you got your PhD in economics from MIT. You started your career in working, I guess, in government institutions, the CBO, the Fed, Freddie Mac. You transitioned to entrepreneurship. Uh, you you became a columnist, a blogger, an author, a public intellectual. Um, let's start at the beginning there. What first drew you into economics as a young man?
I guess a couple of things. One is just there were some very good professors at Swarthmore College, where I went to college, and um, I think I liked the idea of thinking of uh, outcomes coming from a system as opposed to individuals being good or bad. So the X story is people being driven by incentives, so a lot of their behavior is determined. It doesn't come from their character, it comes from their incentives. Maybe I think economists maybe overdo that, but it was an interesting perspective.
So it really was the concept of really almost like it's not what you intend to do; it's what you're incentivized to do, right?
Yeah, again, it's not just an individual's character, it's the system in which they're placed.
Hmm. Did did this strike you? I'm assuming at the time, Ayn Rand's theories about objectivism and things of that nature. Did those tend to support your perhaps your initial thoughts, or did that come later down the road? How does that relate to, say, someone who considers himself a Randian or an anarchist who says like, "Hey, I should always be looking out for number one."
Yeah, I definitely have never taken that point of view. I describe myself as a pragmatic libertarian. That is, uh, I'm struck by government failure as opposed to we shouldn't do things collectively. I think humans are very social beings, highly interdependent, um, and so you really have to the in some ways, the key social question is how to manage this interdependence at this enormous scale of millions of people, because clearly in prehistory, we never learned how to do that. We only learned how to manage interdependence at a small tribal level, never at such a large scale as we attempt to do today.
So let me see. So the thinking there would be that in our everyday lives, in our families, in our small units, we do have that interdependency. We do have that sort of degree of collectivism. Like, say, my own family, my wife, my
Yeah.
children, we have that collectivism. But as we grow that to my neighborhood, to my locality, my municipality, my state, my government, national government rather, uh, that the effectiveness of that collectivism, the need for that collectivism is actually counterproductive?
In a way, yeah. I I like to use the what's called Dunbar's number, which is based on he's a study of primates and said that if you look at the brain size of a primate, it's correlated with how many members of the species they can keep track of. And for humans, it's about 150.
Right,
And what you'll notice is that below 150, uh, the social norms are all informal. They're enforced by direct observation, gossip, um, knowing the people. You get above 150, and the only way people can uh, collectively operate is with formal norms, things that are written down. So in a business, when it crosses the Dunbar number, that's when you start to see the organization chart, the clear hierarchy, the employee manual,
right,
the written down instructions. And that's that's an interesting transition. So within a large society, if you have a really tightly knit group of people under the Dunbar number, they can actually cause the larger society problems because they can, as a group, just decide to violate the rules of society and just look out for one another. So something that works really well at a tribal level, like strong cohesion, the sense of we're in this together, larger society actually may not work out. So it's an interesting problem. This whole problem of human interdependence gets, I think, very complex.
right, right. And when you mentioned the Dunbar number, this is actually something that inherently, I think, excuse me, we've known throughout our history. Weren't the Romans in their way, like with their centurions, like one man is in charge of 100 and no more.
Mm.
They kind of had that early sense, wouldn't you say, that Dunbar number was where you could exercise control and loyalty the most, right? And then as you grew it to the entire empire, the Romans were the first to codify law, correct? So
Yeah.
perhaps they had that instinct even thousands of years ago that, as long as you stay to your 100 men, or that you were okay. A capable leader could foster that sense of togetherness, but as soon as you got to the Caesar level or the senator level, that you had to codify laws in order it's an interesting dichotomy there. I agree with you. At what point did you realize that your real subject wasn't economics, but basically this sort of study of organizational knowledge of large institutions and how they operate and how they may fail?
I guess, I came at that gradually, but so I worked in very different institutions. The Federal Reserve, very hidebound, very hierarchical. And then Freddie Mac was kind of this organizational teenager. When I joined it, it was still under the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and still relatively small. I think it was bigger than the Dunbar number at that point, but hadn't hadn't really formalized its structure. There was still a lot of decisions being made not formally but informally by somebody talking to someone else on the phone. And that was beginning to get in the way. And so it was in the process of transitioning to a more formal structure. So just being there at the time and watching that was useful. And one thing you notice is that in economics, you study a firm, and a firm acts like a unit. It's maximizing things. And then when you're inside a large organization, you realize that there are a lot of areas that are working at cross purposes to one another. So it's not, it isn't the way it's characterized in an economics textbook.
Right. Can you explain that a little more? What do you mean when you get so I understand that the corporation as an entity is trying to maximize its efficiency, maximize its profit, things of that nature. But now when you're talking about, say, an individual department of 20 people or an individual task force or a project team, like explain the dichotomy there between that could be operating at cross purpose with the overall organization.
Yeah, well, I observed a number of conflicts. So you would have people who, it was called the marketing area, who were trying to sign up mortgage lenders to sell mortgages to Freddie Mac. Freddie Mac buys mortgages, sells securities. And the financial who were trying to make sure that the risk and reward relationship of the mortgages they bought were met certain criteria. And so you would end up with the marketing people saying, oh, the finance people are ruining us. We can't compete in the market. We can't buy all the mortgages we want. And the finance people saying, oh, the marketing people are just out to get their bonuses. They just want to get as many mortgages as possible. They don't care about whether the mortgages are really profitable or not. And getting people to uh, recognize each other's um, desires was difficult. There was uh, they you often assumed that the other people were badly motivated and were not motivated in the interest of the corporation as a whole. And trying to change that was something that the corporation had to work on very hard just to get people to, they use the phrase, assume positive motivation. So
Mm.
that was actually a challenge to get people to do that.
My I understand what you're saying, and actually, in my experience, I don't know if you would agree with me. Well, I've always had a theory that American business has suffered and become less efficient because of over the, say, the past 25, 35 years, the elimination of a management layer whose only purpose was to find the proper motivation, how to properly motivate the people in their charge so that their incentives aligned with the benefit of the company. And I've noticed that ever since, let's call it middle management, that layer of middle management was removed for the initial maximization of profit. That then you this sort of conflict between my personal incentive as an employee of the company and then the overall goal of the company. Once it got past that Dunbar number, were not necessarily aligned. I think a lot of that has to do with the conscious decision to get rid of a layer of management whose only purpose was to decipher the motivations, what motivates each individual, and see if they could steer or align that with what was in the best interest of the company. I mean, do you think that has any credence, my observation, or do you think
It,
that's
but well, it can't be all of it. I think that um, there's a tendency in every corporation for managers to justify expanding their turf. So, from top management's point of view, they sit there and they watch this bureaucracy grow and grow, and every decision seems to be rational as well justified. And then they turn around and look at it and they say, oh my goodness, where did we get all these people? And then they all of a sudden cut back. So it's not as simple as saying, well, if we'd just kept these people there, things would be fine. A lot of what they're doing is kind of turf building and uh, creating roadblocks for other people. So it's very difficult to run a large organization.
it is. And for those organizations that did become behemoths and did become successful, what would you say is a common attribute that you could assign either to the leadership of those companies? Is it just a matter of they were fortunate? Is it a matter of they took advantage of government? How would you how would you say uh, companies like Amazon or or say in the old days in IBM or say JP Morgan Chase, how do they achieve that scale and apparently seem to function well?
Well, it used to be one of the biggest sections in bookstores when there were bookstores, was the management literature. tried to answer that question, so I won't claim to have found the answer. But I think uh, the most durable companies are the companies where the founders establish a strong culture, and the culture enables people when they join the company to know uh, what the point of the company is and how they're supposed to behave. And I think that seems to be one factor that is, I think, a necessary factor if you're going to have a long-lived, successful corporation.
Right. The setting up the right culture and then I would assume setting up the right expectations and clearly defining mission statements and things of that nature. All right. Let's transition a little bit here. Obviously, in the United States, we have a highly polarized political environment right now. Whether you're consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Green, whatever, it seems that as we have progressed, say over the last 20 years or so, uh, your political opponent is not just wrong necessarily; they're evil, or they
Right.
just right. Perhaps when you and I were younger men, we could say, well, our political opponents are wrong. We don't think that what they believe would work. Whereas now that almost seems secondary, right? Now it's your political opponent is evil. They are just not even
Mhm.
worthy of the term humans, right? You wrote a book, uh, The Three Languages of Politics, where you claim there's basically three languages, right? There's oppressor versus oppressed. That would be the progressive sort of language. The conservative language would tend to be framed as civilization versus barbarism, and the libertarian language would tend to be freedom versus coercion. Now, you're not talking about necessarily how people fall into these tribes or anything. You're talking about how people view the world and perhaps how they communicate to one another. Talk to me about how these three languages of politics, how you came up with the concept, how you see it as being relevant, especially today in our polarized political environment.
Okay, so here are three things that we'd all agree are bad. Oppression is bad, barbarism is bad, and coercion, not being allowed to do what you should have a right to do, is bad. Um, but what happens, I claim, is that various political tribes take ownership of a particular over fighting a particular bad. So progressives take ownership over fighting oppression, and in the process, they accuse people who disagree with them of being on the side of the oppressor. And conservatives take ownership over fighting barbarism. In the process, they accuse people who disagree with them of being nihilists and on the side of barbarism. And libertarians accuse their opponents of being statists. So the language is used primarily to denounce people from the other tribe and to raise your status within your own tribe. Like the more you denounce other people, the more you're perceived as being a loyal member of your tribe. So if you're progressive and you frame things in this oppressor oppressed framework, you'll get the status, your status within the tribe will rise. So that's my hypothesis of how these languages become uh, used and become reinforced and sort of cause the tribe to become tighter and tighter. Um, and just, the question is sort of why that has gotten so pervasive, increasingly pervasive over the last 20 years.
Yeah, that
Um,
is a great question. So let me ask you, like, why do you think that has gotten increased? Like it has. I think for those of us who have been around long enough to have seen like or at least be aware of the Kennedy Nixon debates or the Reagan when the Reagan Revolution took over, which was a complete 180 in terms of how
what,
completely skewed? Like, what's the difference between then and now?
um, I think a few things. It's like this. That's like the $64,000 question. I don't claim to have all the answer. Uh, Among the changes that have occurred are you could almost call it more democracy, in particular the primary system, where it makes it uh, less possible to compromise. So in 1964, the most important piece of social legislation was the Civil Rights Bill, and it was passed in a bipartisan way, and the opposition was bipartisan. The opposition obviously didn't prevail. Um, so you had an environment in which a Republican could work with a Democrat on the major social issue of the time and not get, and neither one would get primaried out of office because most of them weren't even chosen in primaries in those days. So that's one, I think, one big change. And another one that's, I think, obvious to most people is the media environment changing from a media that promoted consensus, in part because the large media companies had such large market share that uh, they could they could sell advertising, and their main goal was to have as broad a market as possible to not alienate people, so that they could uh, get their advertisers to pay more money. And now the environment is much more fragmented, and you can't rely on, having the owning the classified advertising market or owning the TV advertising market. You have to instead try to get subscription revenue, and the people who will pay for subscriptions are the people who are most passionate on one side or the other, so that the media environment tends to be reinforce the most intense partisan people. So that's another of the factors that is different from 70 years ago or so.
Absolutely, I tend to agree with you. Um, in terms of our political society, or even our tribalization, in terms of these three languages that you claim exist, how does what we talked about earlier, the individual's incentive, how does that operate within the framework? Because even though we're speaking different languages, wouldn't we still be able to somehow see through the clutter and find out what's in our best interest?
I think what people perceive their interest in this environment or to be well regarded within your tribe. So that so instead of, sort of looking around for what's true, looking underneath these simplistic languages, people just say, well, if I go on Twitter and I signal using these languages, I mean, they're not even conscious about it. They just know that they get reinforced by saying what their other tribe members like to hear. And they also feel more comfortable themselves. Anytime you're questioning the point of view of the people who you think of as your tribe, that can become uncomfortable.
Do you think there's a limit to that to that desire to signal within your own tribe, or to gain status within your tribe? For example, uh, if I'm a conservative right now, or a MAGA, if you want to use that term, and up until now I've been very pro MAGA, like what will it take, in your opinion, for me to and I may have been so against my self-interest,
Mhm.
right? So if I agreed with trade tariffs and I see inflation rising and it hits my pocket, maybe maybe I'll go along with it. If I'm anti-immigration and I see that it's not helping the economy, okay, maybe I'll go with it, or my rights being infringed. At what level, or at what point do you think, would you venture a guess that an individual would say, even within their own political language, saying, "Stop! I have to try to understand what the other side is saying," or I at least have to try to formulate an understanding of something beyond my tribe.
Yeah, I'm pessimistic that the content is what matters. I say that people decide what to believe by deciding who to believe. So if you were in a cult, and you believed some crazy conspiracies and you followed some crazy rituals, and I wanted to get you out of that cult, just telling you, I think you're in a cult, this is crazy, here's something logical, will probably just get you to more tightly bond to that cult. I have to be able to show you that you'll be loved and supported by other people outside the cult. And I think probably the same thing has to happen for someone to change political beliefs. I don't necessarily think it'll be a a purely logical process of being talked out of something and talked into something else.
Do you think that sort of realization or adaptation, and perhaps I'm asking you a loaded question, do you think that works top down or does it work bottom up? For example, would it take progressive tribe? Does it take someone like a John Fetterman saying President Trump is right in his Iran actions? Does it take someone at that level or vice versa to for an individual in the progressive tribe to say, well, if Fetterman says it's okay, then I guess I must also try to understand that viewpoint? Or does it work more on the individual level? My brother is of the opposite, speaks the
Yeah,
opposite language. Is that more likely to have an effect on me? Because that the macro signaling is much less if it's my brother, but if
yeah.
it's the senator or the president or whatever, that might have. Which one do you think would be more effective?
Um, the, I guess I think it probably both happen at around the same time.
Mm,
So, if that you do see, I think in elections, I'm not an expert, but somewhat of a bandwagon effect where you get to a point where so many people are convinced of a certain perspective on the election that it just won't change. So I think there was just a widespread perception in the 2024 election that uh, among sort of working class people that Kamala Harris wasn't like them
mm,
and Donald Trump was like them. So you had this movement of working class people, including African Americans and Hispanics, in the just away from Harris on the grounds that well she's just not doesn't seem like us, and it's sort of a combination of how the media present things and how um, so I just yeah again I think it's just kind of a bandwagon and that it's sort of scary in that like right now the bandwagon could go strongly in one direction, strongly in the other, and it's
yeah,
hard to predict how.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Um, do you feel that your three political language model is a little too neat? Do you think there might be like a fourth or a fifth political language that's substantive or substantial enough for to be included in sort of like your
Yeah,
manual? Just
yeah. I don't think it's a model that you would use at all times in all places. I think for a long time it it wasn't. I'd say when I first put it out, it seemed valid, and then right around the time Trump comes forward, it seems less valid. Then with the Gaza war, it seemed especially valid because if somebody was an opponent of Israel, they almost always used an oppressor-oppressed framing, and if they were a supporter of Israel, they almost always used a civilization barbarism framing. In fact, the prime minister of Israel, when he came to speak to Congress, said, I think in about his second or third sentence, this is civilization versus barbarism. So, so I think the model kind of revived at that point. But if nothing else, I think there's a fourth language of the kind of brokenism versus institutional reform. So there are people who just think, there are a lot of institutions that they just don't trust anymore. The only answer is to break them. And then people on the other side say, no, we need institutions. We just have to reform them. And President Trump came in and I think shocked people by putting a lot of the brokenness in. I would put uh, RFK Jr. and some of the other people in the health area in the brokenness camp. I think um, that so I think that's a real division, and it's a division that's kind of cross parties. There, on the Democratic side, you have uh, I think the brokenness are represented by AOC and maybe Bernie. That just let's really make some radical changes here, and the institutionalists are represented by people who say, hey, we can't go crazy here. We can't have crazy, unpopular policies on transgenderism. We can't be so anti-American. So there's that division, and then there's kind of a similar division on the Republican side.
And you certainly see it even in libertarian circles. Say, if we were to look at our own tribe, you could go all the way from the anarchists who just want to tear down everything to, like, say, a classical liberal or a constitutionalist that says, no, there's value in these institutions. It's just that they're not being run properly or they've lost sight of their original mission. So I could see where it could break into those,
Yeah,
fourth potential language as well.
yeah, no, there are definitely reformists and brokenness and within the libertarian camp, and libertarians tend to be very strident, whichever their view is. So you'll hear them say bad things about the other sides are traitors and so on.
Well, when people bring that up about our sort of tribe, I always laugh at something Spike Cohen said, which was trying to get libertarians to work together is like trying to catch a butterfly that's on amphetamine while you're on amphetamines as well, or something to that effect. That it's
Yeah.
trying to, it's crazy trying to herd libertarians, especially to work together. But yeah, I could see that. Having said brokenism versus institutionalism, like, typically speaking, I would say you're someone who's advocated for distributed knowledge. You've warned against the danger of centralized knowledge. But is there, in your opinion, any value to these institutions? Like, you brought up RFK. This is an argument in my house that is almost 24/7 because my wife is a microbiologist, so she's very much into, we build upon each other's knowledge, and that's what science is, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you find any value in institutions? So is the reason that just because something is an institution, we are to discredit it or discard it, or is it just another resource? How do you view that?
Um, I'm probably, I'd say probably at least 60% institutionalist and no more than 40% brokenist.
Mm.
I think that what is most broken right now is higher education. I think the the culture has flattened there. People point out that in America different locations used to be very different. But if you go to sort of suburban America, no matter where you are, you see the same shopping malls, the same restaurant chains, the same store chains. And so we talk about a flattening culture. I think that's happened in higher education. I think if you could sort of time travel back to the early 1960s, the culture at a Princeton University would not be the same as Harvard or Yale or Michigan or a small college. Now I think they are that has been flattened out and they're the same. And that's not a good thing in general. You need more diversity, but in particular, uh, the political environment is just absurdly left. And so having that particular flat culture is really bad. So I'm definitely a brokenist on the higher education, but I'm probably more of an institutionalist on something like political parties.
And so it sounds like you're just willing to take each institution and analyze it and figure out if you're a
Yeah,
brokenist to that particular institution or a supporter of the institution, which I think is the reasonable way to go. Speaking of higher education, how do you think it became so leftist? I mean, that's a look. I went to college in the '80s, and even then, I was saying like, oh, I went to a Jesuit university, and I still thought that was too liberal in the way they
yeah,
approached things. So even 45, 50 years ago, there were people complaining that higher education was drifting leftward. I will admit it's nowhere near as bad as it is today.
yeah,
Uh, what do you think contributed to that? Aging '60s activists who got into academia, or is it just what would you say?
yeah. I think there's something about living in the academic world that uh, has people lean that way. Not There are probably a bunch of characteristics there. The classic one being the professor jealous of the business person. Hey, I'm really smarter than them. Why am I not higher status, higher wealth, and so on? Um, so I think you can go back even more than the 1980s. I mean, you can go back 100 years and find that there's this kind of differing view of the intellectuals versus the people who are in commerce. The But the snowballing effect, I think it just goes back to this general flattening out monoculture. I think we would have had if the coin had come up slightly differently, the monoculture might be conservative or centrist. But uh, once it uh, got heavy enough on the left, then it just became impossible for conservatives and centrists to survive. Um, and part of it is kind of a leftist attitude that they don't deserve to survive. That we're the only ones who have any moral standing whatsoever. Um, and so they've just driven out anyone to the right of the far left, and that's Um, so you really have these institutions that are almost unfixable.
I
Although again, there are plenty of people who would take the institutionalist view and say, yeah, no, we can fix them. We have to fix them.
right.
I don't take that view.
I've often heard it said, and I perhaps I agree to it to some with it to some extent, which is that within universities, if you were to go, say, to the science departments, people who are trying to become engineers, you graduated from MIT, I'm sure you were surrounded by them. The so-called scientists, the nerds, the
Yeah,
mathematicians. Those folks have very results-based outcomes as part of their studies, right? You either blew up the physics lab or you didn't when you performed your
yeah,
experiment, right?
yeah,
They have very results-oriented things, and perhaps it's been argued that for those types of learnings, those that type of an education, the institution of a university might still function well, but it comes to the liberal arts, to the humanities, that they're that that's where you see this like overwhelming leftward bias and the educational drift. Do you agree with that? That because
I
once
think that I think that division is narrowing. That um, the the pressure to publish is the dominant factor, and that means that scientists have become increasingly, I'll just use the word corrupt. That is, um, there's more fraud now than there was. There's more sort of pleasing the other people in your field has just become very important. So it's actually become more possible to enforce ideological conformity in science than you would have thought possible, 30 years ago.
I can see that. Do you feel that the so-called death of expertise has caused that increase in even in the sciences of fraud and is it the death of expertise that caused it, or is the opposite true? That this drive to publish at all costs and this drive to that has caused the death of expertise, and then it becomes you're trapped in a feedback loop.
Yeah, so I think it's probably more the latter that sort of if you think of game one, one way to play the game is to be, I'm trying to build on knowledge, and I'm trying to, make my science better. The other game is I'm trying to get ahead in the system. And once those incentives start to diverge, it just becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, I could definitely see that because I think sadly, um, one of the things that I find frustrating is that you just can't get at the truth anymore. It's one thing to know the facts, to know the truth, and then have an opinion about it. We can all interpret actual truth in different ways, but we can't even get primary sources anymore. And to me, that is the real tragedy. That someone who is willing to take the time to research and to may not have access to actual true statements anymore. That it's become so easy to publish and consolidate falsehoods that they just then propagate on their own. They take a life of their own, which kind of brings me to AI. Now, one of the things that when I was doing some studying up on you, Arnold, was that you made this statement that basically said that by the end of this year, by the end of 2026, it may be imprudent to rely solely on human legal or medical advice due to the emergence and the progress of AI. First of all, what led you to make that statement? Let's start there. What led you to make that statement? Because it's a very provocative statement, right?
Yeah. Well, I have, so it's hard for anyone to know exactly how these models work. And in fact, the people who are closest to them don't always agree and don't even all necessarily claim to know how they work. I have I subscribe to a point of view that I think is a minority point of view, but I think it's right. So what I would say, the majority of people assume they act as if the frontier models like OpenAI or Claude from Anthropic or whatever, that they are like a 5-year-old kid or not 5, let's say 10-year-old kid who's read the encyclopedia and memorized it, sort of an idiot savant kind of thing. I think of the models as pattern matchers. That is, they find deep patterns in things. And when you see, and so they might be could see in text, and they might apply it to or a radiological image. that the patterns, they don't find patterns quite the way you or I would, or they find them the way you or I would if we were had fell into schizophrenia or took acid or
Mm.
something like that. So you get on the on the negative side of that, you get the phenomenon of hallucination, where we'll confidently say something that we know is wrong, just as a schizophrenic might do that. And but on the other hand, they find things that you would say, "Oh, only a genius could find this," or that was, and yeah. So the important thing, I'm sort of getting away from this uh, kid who memorized the encyclopedia model and toward this pattern setting model, and I'm watching them getting better and better and better, and that's uh, if no one person can keep track of the models, but if you watch what I call the chatter, the people who are sort of big believers in AI are moving in the direction of, well, they're just getting better. And the people who are skeptics, some of them are shifting over. So I've seen a couple of economists who I think who were at least non-users of AI now saying, "Oh God, this is amazing. This is better than what if I sent this paper off to to a journal, I wouldn't get as accurate and helpful a referee report as what I just got from this AI."
Right.
Um, and I've seen that myself. Of sort of, I'll submit something to an AI and get something back and say, "Wow, if a human had thought of that, I would have been really, really impressed." Um, so that, and I think that just comes from this pattern matching and whatever else they're doing to improve these models. Um, so then when you apply it to sort of law or medicine, I mean, your instinct is to say, do I trust the 10-year-old who's memorized the encyclopedia, or do I trust a doctor who, is a specialist and has all this domain knowledge? Well, clearly, if you have that in your mind, you trust the doctor. But if you have the other in mind, you might say, at some point, these frontier models are going to get better at your specialty than you are. And so, um, probably, I'm thinking by the end of this year, it'll be a combination of the domain expert, the lawyer or the doctor, and the model. But if you throw out either one, this year, you're going to be making a mistake. And if you ask me where that goes in 3 or 4 years, you might be able to get away with throwing away the doctor or the lawyer and just
Mm.
relying on the model.
Well, I tend to agree with you because I view these. In my younger years, I was a coder, and I back in the '90s, I tried my hand at doing the hot coding back then, which was parallel programming and very very basic language modeling. And I've always viewed these things as a tool more than anything else. Like I don't trust AI to be creative or something, but uh, as a tool, I find them extremely useful and extremely efficient and very, very, very helpful. And it will be interesting in 3 or 4 years to see if that sort of pattern recognition and sort of validation of their core data set helps because those, if you look at something like Grok, which was initially trained on Twitter, Grok was a horrible AI started because it would only look at that subset of data that existed on Twitter or X. And now, as it's incorporating more sources, it's getting better. Do you think AI vindicates or challenges your views about distributed knowledge?
You, possibly, you can have so the classic argument for decentralized markets is there's a lot of knowledge out there that's in people's heads that um, that that they can't articulate. It's called tacit knowledge. Also, there's just so much complexity that is simplified for people if all they have to do is face a price. If all they have to do is face a price, I don't have to know why um, gasoline became more expensive. I just know I want to use less of it. I don't have to, become a geopolitical strategist or whatever. But if you're trying to plan the economy from the center, you have to know all that stuff. Um, I think it's possible for an AI to learn more of both of those things. It may learn, it can handle more of the complexity. Uh, it can understand how a higher gasoline price came to be and consider how to deal with it. And the other thing is that may be able to infer things that are tacit in people's minds that it couldn't infer before. Having said that, I don't think that's going to be a very big deal. I don't think we're going to discover that an AI can centrally plan the economy anytime uh,
Right.
in this decade.
Do you think there's danger though that if people start becoming more and more reliant on AI, and as you mentioned earlier, there's really not even among the creators of the AI, there's really not a good understanding of how it's built up its pattern recognition and that the foundational data that it may have been based on may have been biased or incorrect. And there's been a lot of, I think, study put in that area. So from that perspective, do you feel if there's an AI, whether it's just to use the popular ones now, like a ChatGPT or a Claude or something like that, or they're using the internet as their primary sources for the most part. Are you concerned that it may be building this wonderful mechanism on a pile of garbage that, if it had, initial bad premises or biased data, that it's just gonna propagate that as it becomes more and more integrated into our daily lives?
Um, that's not my chief concern over it. I think um, as long as kind of the internal reward systems it has are uh, for accuracy and uh, getting good results, I don't think it will uh, degenerate into garbage. Again, if you just thought of it as reading the encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia had a lot of bad data in it, that you would that would be a big concern. But I don't think of it. I think they've got the models. The people building the models are putting in reward systems that I think make that less of a risk.
Do you think what would if there's any potential, hazards with the growing role that AI plays in our lives and looking ahead, what do you think is the greatest liability? What do you think is the greatest possible threat, if any, that comes out of AI?
Um, I would say one thing is it could make evil people a lot more capable.
Mm,
They could, um, especially as people trust AI to do more and more, or trust computers to do more and more, um, then evil people can do worse things. The other thing is sort of uh, kind of losing a sense of meaning. Somebody asked me the other day, "Well, um, what will happen to, let's say, a student or an intellectual when they just get the feeling that there's nothing that they can do that's as smart as what an AI does? Do they, where do they get their sense of meaning and purpose if that happens?" And that's a tough question to answer. I used to play this board game competitively, game called Othello,
mhm.
sort of like chess or checkers. I took it very seriously until somebody wrote a computer program that I just could not possibly beat. And that was it for me for never wanting to play an Othello tournament again. Now, it's interesting in the world of chess, the people are very active in that world now, even though we know that the best chess players are computer programs. I don't quite understand why that is or how that is, but uh, to me, that's the question. We retain our sense of purpose and meaning in a world where, any problem that we could solve, an AI could solve better.
Yeah, and certainly the answer to that question would have huge ramifications in a lot of different areas, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole.
Mm,
All right, Arnold, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. Right now, though, I always save a little time for something I call the final five. These are five questions that they're not serious at all, but it just helps the audience understand a little bit more about you. So that, again, let's just go through
okay.
these. Hopefully, it won't take too long. First of all, Arnold, be honest. Right before you read a Paul Krugman column, do you take deep breaths before or after you read the column?
I don't read the column. I just read the headline I know he's going to say.
So you don't even bother with the agita if
Yeah.
you come across a column. Okay. Hayek wrote about the limits of human knowledge. Do you think Hayek himself was an expert?
Yes.
So that's one of those cases where there is some expertise just coming out. If Adam Smith, Hayek, and Keynes invited you to poker night, who would you assume is bluffing first? And would you fold out of politeness or principle?
Um, well, I think Keynes would be the better poker player and the more aggressive one. Um, so uh, I guess I would fold if either the others bet aggressively, but with Keynes, I'd kind of um, maybe I need to call him to kind of keep him honest.
Right. You'd have to stress test Keynes a little bit more than Smith or Hayek. Um, if AI becomes better than humans at a growing number of tasks, what human skill would you still be most reluctant to hand over?
Um, would I most be reluctant to hand over? Let's see. Uh, well, I wouldn't want to stop dancing. That be,
Dancing. So maybe in general, you're talking about something creative, right? Whether it's dancing, music, perhaps poetry or something like that. Or do you feel something like poetry eventually could be in within the domain of AI?
yeah, I guess I lean toward, I don't want to give up physical things. I'd like to still, if I were younger, I'd like to still play baseball or something like that.
Okay. And then the final question. After an hour with me, do you think we're speaking the same political language or are we just politely taking turns in adjacent dialects?
Um, I would guess speaking the same language, but um, probably not trying, but trying to avoid sticking to any one language. Trying to, um, I think once people read and internalize my book, they s- they hesitate to just speak in one language. They get a little bit more respect for other languages.
Having been aware of the other languages, you might, to your point, have a little respect for them. All right, thank you very much, Dr. Arnold Kling. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. For all of our viewers out there, please follow Dr. Kling. He has a Substack. Dr. Kling, can you tell us the name of your Substack?
It's in my tribe, but I think if you Google Arnold Kling Substack, you land there pretty easily.
Fantastic. I'm sure everyone who's already not doing it will be more than eager to do it. For everyone else, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to get more interviews with really, really impressive minds like Dr. Kling. And until next time, this has been Big John. Peace, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much.